As imperialistic powers handed over government control to former colonies, they often created new states. Between 1945 and 2000, the number of independent states in the world more than doubled, from approximately 75 to around 190. The boundaries of new states often led to conflicts, population displacement, and resettlement. In India, the country was partitioned into Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. Later, Pakistan divided again, creating Bangladesh. In the Middle East, the newly created Israel displaced Palestinian residents. Newly independent countries often instituted strong policies to promote economic development. At the same time, migrants from the newly independent countries kept alive cultural and economic ties as they migrated to the colonizing countries, usually to large cities. The Zionist movement originated in the 1890s from reaction to the Dreyfus Affair in France. Theodor Herzl, a Hungarian Jewish intellectual and journalist, used the affair as evidence that assimilation of Jews into European society was failing to provide safety and equal opportunity. At the First Zionist Congress in 1897, he urged the creation of a separate Jewish state. Zionists hoped the new state could be established in Palestine because that was where their ancestors had lived. In modern times, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, and most of its inhabitants were Arabs who practiced Islam. In a new state, Zionists argued, Jews could be free of persecution. In 1917, during World War I, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, which favored the establishment in Palestine of a national home for Jewish people. However, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The situation was complicated because British officer T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, promised certain Arabs an independent state as well. The British Foreign Office hoped that Arabs would rise up against the Ottoman Empire, which would make it easier to defeat during World War I. The Balfour Declaration promised civil and religious rights to non-Jews in Palestine, but the supporters of the Arabs did not trust the British. In 1918, after World War I, Britain was given a mandate over former Ottoman lands in the Middle East. Soon, Zionists began to immigrate to Palestine from Europe and from other Middle Eastern areas. As immigration increased, the Arabs in the area protested their loss of land and traditional Islamic way of life. World War II and the deaths of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust provided another reason for Jewish immigration. The fate of the European Jews brought worldwide sympathy for the survivors. Britain, trying to hold the line on Jewish immigration in the face of Arab opposition, turned the matter over to the United Nations. As in India, leaders hoped that partition would bring peace and stability. In 1948, after the UN divided Palestine into Jewish and Arab sections, the Jewish section declared itself to be a new country, Israel. War broke out immediately between Israel, which had support from the United States, and the Palestinians, who had support from neighboring Arab countries. Arab forces from Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded Israel. After several ceasefires, the Israeli army won, and an armed truce was declared. Immediately after the truce, about 400,000 Palestinians became refugees, living in camps near the Israeli border. 3 other Israeli-Palestinian wars followed. In 1956, Israel, with the support of France and Great Britain, invaded Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, in part to liberate the Suez Canal, which the Egyptian government had nationalized under Gamal Abdel Nasser's economic programs. Following international protest, Israel and its allied forces were ordered to withdraw from Egypt. In the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel fought on 3 fronts at once. Israel gained the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. In the Yom Kippur War of 1973, Israel repelled a surprise invasion by Egypt and Syria. After 30 years of conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, U.S. President Jimmy Carter mediated the Camp David Accords, a peace agreement between Prime Minister Begin of Israel and President Sadat of Egypt. However, the Palestinians and several Arab states rejected the 1979 peace treaty. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, and its longtime leader Arafat wanted the return of occupied lands and the creation of an independent nation of Palestine. In the 21st century, the peace process became more complicated when the Palestinians split into two factions. The Fatah faction controlled the West Bank, and the Hamas faction controlled Gaza. Security concerns led the Israeli government to implement tighter border controls on the West Bank and on Gaza. These controls, amounting to economic sanctions, severely restricted normal activity for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and fomented anger. Israel further angered Palestinians by approving new settlements on lands it had occupied during previous wars, lands Palestinians considered theirs. Without a peace process, violence continued. Between 2000 and 2014, over 7,000 Palestinian and over 1,000 Israelis were killed. Many countries in the Middle East remain hostile to the United States over its support of Israel. After World War II, Vietnam's neighbor, Cambodia, pressured France to grant it independence in 1953. Cambodia's royal family continued to head the government and tried to maintain its status as a non-aligned nation during the first 2 decades of the Cold War. However, Cambodia was eventually drawn into the Vietnam War. Following the Vietnam War, a communist guerrilla organization called the Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of Pol Pot, overthrew the right-wing government of Cambodia. Once in power, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge imposed a ruthless form of communism, following the Chinese model of cultural revolution that targeted intellectuals and dissenters. The slaughter and famine that followed took more than 2 million lives, about 1/4 of the country's population. Mass graves of victims from the killing fields of Cambodia continue to be discovered in the countryside and jungles today. In 1977, Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia to support opponents of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. At the end of the ensuing war, the Vietnamese took control of the government in Cambodia and helped the country to regain some stability, even as some fighting continued and hundreds of thousands of refugees fled the country. In 1989, Vietnamese forces completed their withdrawal from Cambodia. A peace agreement reached in 1991 allowed free elections monitored by the United Nations. Prince Sihanouk became a constitutional monarch, and the country developed a democratic government with multiple political parties and aspects of a market economy. In 1947, the British divided colonial India into 2 independent countries, a mostly Hindu India and a mostly Muslim Pakistan. India's population was about 10 times larger than Pakistan. In both countries, women had the right to vote. The partition of the colony was chaotic, and violence broke out along religious lines. At least 10 million people moved. Hindus and Sikhs fled their homes in Pakistan to resettle in India, and Muslims fled India for Pakistan. In the political turmoil, between 500,000 and 1 million people died. After partition, Pakistani and Indian distrust grew. While India became the world's largest democracy, Pakistan had both elected leaders and authoritarian military rulers. Moderates in both countries confronted powerful conservative religious movements that opposed compromise with the other country. One persistent tension between India and Pakistan was over Kashmir, a border region in the mountainous north. At the time of partition, most people in Kashmir were Muslims, but its leader was a Hindu. Therefore, both Pakistan and India claimed Kashmir. At times, the rivalry there broke out into armed conflict. The tension between the two countries became more significant after each began developing nuclear weapons. Eventually, India controlled about 45% of Kashmir region, Pakistan controlled about 35%, and China controlled about 20%. In some emerging countries, women became heads of state. Often they replaced their fathers or husbands. In India and Pakistan, women won the right to vote in 1947. The world's first female prime minister was Bandaranaike. She won that position in 1960 in Ceylon, or later Sri Lanka. Her husband was assassinated in office in 1959, and Bandaranaike ran for office to fill his seat. She continued her husband's socialist economic policies, but in 1965, with a sagging economy, she was voted out of office. 5 years later, she returned to power and instituted much more radical policies, including land reforms, restrictions on free enterprise, and a new constitution that changed the country's name to Sri Lanka. While some of her reforms succeeded, the economy stalled again, and in 1977, she was again voted out of office. Bandaranaike remained active in Sri Lankan politics. Her children became leaders as well. When her daughter, Chandrika, became the country's first female president in 1994, she appointed her mother again to the role of prime minister. In 1966, 2 years after the death of India's first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, his only child, Indira Gandhi, became India's leader. She was not related to Mohandas Gandhi. She was underestimated at first, but proved to be effective, distancing herself in some ways from her father's old guard advisors and making political and economic moves to strengthen India's economy. War with Pakistan took a toll on the economy, though India won the conflict with the help of military support from the Soviet Union. Indira Gandhi became a revered leader in India, though further economic strife would undermine her popularity in the ensuing years. High inflation and growing poverty threatened her rule. She declared a national emergency in 1975 and jailed many opposition leaders. Her 20-point economic program proved successful, alleviating inflation, reforming corrupt laws, and increasing national production. But some of her policies were unpopular with the people of India despite the economic gains. In 1977, Gandhi lost in the elections. She returned to power as prime minister in 1980, but was assassinated in 1984. Pakistan elected Benazir Bhutto prime minister in 1988. Her father had also served as prime minister. She was the first elected female leader of a majority Muslim country. Bhutto struggled to improve Pakistan's economy and reduce its poverty. Corruption charges dogged her and her husband. Bhutto won election to 2 non-consecutive terms and then went into exile from 1999 until 2007. Shortly after she returned to Pakistan, an assassin killed her. Tanganyika gained its independence from Britain in 1961, later becoming the United Republic of Tanzania. Its first president, Julius Nyerere, instituted African socialist political and economic ideas, summarized in the Arusha Declaration of 1967. It was an egalitarian approach based on cooperative agriculture. Literacy campaigns, free education, and collective farming were key components of what Nyerere called familyhood. He also advanced the country's economic independence away from foreign aid. Economic hardships challenged Nyerere leadership for years, as did conflicts with Uganda and its leader, Idi Amin. Though personally popular, Nyerere could not pull Tanzania out of poverty. He resigned the presidency in 1985 but remained an important social leader until his death in 1999. People from the newly independent country sometimes moved to the former colonial powers. For example, large numbers of refugees and immigrants from Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh moved to London after the chaos of World War II and other conflicts. London was a metropole, a large city of former colonial ruler. Similarly, Vietnamese, Algerians, and West Africans migrated to Paris and other cities in France, and Filipinos migrated to the United States. Many migrants found jobs in the medical field. Others worked on railroads, in foundries, and in airports. In this way, economic and cultural ties between the colonial power and newly independent countries remained strong.